way through the challenge is to get still and ask yourself, what is the next right move?
Welcome to the Unconventional Founder podcast, where we uncover the mindsets, practices, and strategies used by successful non-technical founders. Our mission for this podcast is to empower you with the information you need to help you get as far as you can. That said, let's get into it. Dr. Prash, thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure, Dave.
There's a ton of things that I want to ask you about, but I want to probably start about, so you studied psychiatry and psychotherapy. What made you get into that? Why did you want to get into that? That's where I'd love to start.
Yeah, I didn't start off wanting to be a psychiatrist. I finished medical school and started off, I wanted to be a surgeon, to be honest. And that was the initial training path that I was taking. And then the short answer is that psychedelics came into my life, and that caused a pretty significant shift in everything from the way I saw the world to what I wanted to devote my life and time to. Shared as it might sound, the body ceased to be anywhere near as interesting as did operating on the body, and the opportunity to, well, it sounds kind of creepy to say operate on the mind, but to work with the mind on a day-to-day basis meant that I left to pursue psychiatry training just so I could work with psychedelics and psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy.
Yeah, right. So you were training to become a lawyer?
A surgeon.
A surgeon. Okay, cool.
Yes, after medical school.
Wow. Okay. Amazing. And then you pivoted. It's a nice tech term.
Yes.
And
very early on, thankfully.
Yeah.
Yeah, pre-seed pivoted.
And so you've worked in the psychiatry field for how many years?
It's been about a decade, more than a decade now. Yeah. Since 2013.
Clinical setting.
Yeah, I started off at the Alfred Hospital, did all my training at the Alfred Hospital, and then now most of my work is either in private or in clinical trials.
Amazing. And you're also an entrepreneur, which I find an incredible mix. And I want to understand, what was your first entrepreneurial endeavor?
My first entrepreneurial endeavor.
Or when was the time when you felt like, oh, I think like I'm excited about like creating something? It doesn't have to be a business, could be.
My first entrepreneurial endeavor, which this is a story I don't often tell, I guess, it never comes up, was called the Crop Cultivators Collective. And that was while I was a medical student doing a rotation out in Mildura. And I'll cut a long story short, but essentially farmers were culling kangaroo all the time because they were pests on their land. And butchers were selling kangaroo, but that was all commercially farmed. And I saw an opportunity for a resource that was going to waste on the land to then match up with the resource that was commercially viable. And it became a matter of setting up a hunting roster, a deposit roster, a cold room with a lockbox, and a password that would change depending on who was on roster, and setting up an arrangement between the farmers and the butcher. Brokerage, really. It was kangaroo brokerage, not too far from Caleb Brown's origins. And that was my first business. And I thought I was a genius. I mean, I guess at the time it made a lot of sense, and it was until there was an outbreak that wiped out a bunch of wild kangaroo in Queensland, I think, and then regulation changed very rapidly. You weren't allowed to sell the kangaroo meat that wasn't commercially farmed. And so that might cut my fledgling kangaroo brokerage off at the knees very early on, which is probably a good thing.
That's amazing. I think that's such a cool business. I think not many people start a kangaroo brokerage. So,
which I've never used that term before, but yeah, it was opportunistic.
A kangaroo exchange.
That's right. That's right.
Maybe some good experience for your future businesses.
Correct.
That's so interesting. And tell me more about other businesses that you've started. Did you take a bit of time away from entrepreneurship after that?
That didn't even feel like entrepreneurship. I don't think everyone understood that was entrepreneurship. That was just a little side hustle that I was doing to make myself some money. I was in med school, and then, but really, when I started Caleb Brown in 2016, and at that point, my understanding of business was rudimentary at best and non-existent at worst. And I had to teach myself everything from scratch, about business, about finance. I didn't know anything, which was a very, very steep learning curve when you're starting the business in an industry that is, one, accelerating at such a rapid rate, and two, has got booby traps and pitfalls at absolutely every corner. Like, this is, we're talking 2016 crypto, a minefield, absolute minefield. And it's like going for a trek through Pol Pot's Cambodia, right? And yeah, that was not the kind of MBA I recommend anyone do, but it's effective.
So, for those listening, what was the business? What was the?
Yeah. So Caleb and Brown is, well, technically is the world's first dedicated cryptocurrency brokerage. So different from an exchange, and then an exchange is sort of doing everything yourself. Our primary value proposition, which remains still what sets us apart today globally, is that every client gets a personal broker, and you pick up the phone, you call your broker, and he manages everything that you need within the crypto ecosystem for you. No matter where you are in the world, what time of day or night, we run a 24/7 service, and either your broker or his counterpart on the other side of the world will answer. This is how we sort of service a global population, and execute anything you want. In crypto world, where one, the market doesn't sleep, it's a 24/7 market, and two, where things move so quickly that speed of execution is worth a lot, or can be potentially worth a lot, or rather the opportunity cost of not having speed of execution could cost a lot. That is integral. And also started up because, I mean, I'm a psychiatrist. I understand people. This is essentially a people business. There was a huge knowledge gap. I mean, there still is a huge knowledge gap. People don't know how to engage with the crypto ecosystem, how to invest in it, how to trade with it, what to do exactly, how not to get scammed by it. The booby traps continue on to the consumer space, and so that is the service that we offer. You get a guy, you got your guy, and your guy will manage everything for you. And that's Caleb and Brown.
That's so cool, and so a high level of trust, obviously, and because I think a lot of when people hear about crypto, there's been a lot of recent news stories. FTX is probably the most famous one, and so it does make a lot of sense why having a high touch, team of experienced people would be successful. So
yeah, it's a difficult business to run because it's so resource intensive, and because it's a 24/7 business that you're running. I've had one day off in 8 years. Shudder thinking about it. But it's a necessary service and a worthwhile service. Yeah.
what was the first 6 months of that like? So where did you start? Did you start at home?
So the interesting thing is the origin story of that is I got really interested in cryptocurrency from Bitcoin, particularly from an ideological standpoint. And this dude I got to know quite well because we used to play soccer together every Wednesday for about 5 years, was deep into that space and worked in the crypto space. And he was a big education point for me. I got to the point where I was trying to put larger and larger amounts of money into crypto. I sold my house, and I had a pretty good idea that I wanted to put more and more of it into Bitcoin. And at that time, if you were trying to put, even 50 grand on local markets, you were pumping your way so far down the order book that it didn't make sense anymore. You were shooting yourself in the foot. So we decided we would buy off international exchanges. And then we realized there was a 7%, between 5 to 7% arbitrage opportunity between international markets and local markets, which seemed like an opportunity. And so that's what we started up as, an arbitrage desk, which was cowboy country, really, at the time, because you were sending money to an exchange, a Russian exchange registered in Belarus, operating out of Liechtenstein, with a bank account in Mongolia. I'm not making any of this up. And you'd send your money, and you wait about, a week to 10 days, then you get a support ticket in Russian. You Google Translate the support ticket, and you'd be like, my money got there. And you buy the Bitcoin, send it over here, and sell it on local exchanges, make your little arbitrage, and then repeat it all over again. And all it required is a certain amount of circulating capital and really massive kahunas. But then
the first time you must have been somewhat worried.
Yes, soiling my pants. Absolutely. Absolutely. But it's alarming how quickly you get desensitized to risk. Or maybe that's something in my personality. Probably is something in my personality. And then it became evident that, well, we could be doing this, offering this service to people. Why are we selling it on an exchange? We could be offering this to people because you started to hear the rumblings around us and no one knew how to engage. And here we were, we'd sort of worked out or cracked the code to the most difficult part of the operation, it felt like. So we could and should offer this. And so that's how Caleb and Brown began and has scaled since. And it's always been a constant process of trying to stay as close to the regulatory landscape as possible. I often describe us as the most boring business in crypto because really it is. There's nothing superbly flash about what we're doing. It's just it's a really solid business. But I guess in that there's longevity.
That's great.
Crypto is exciting enough. We don't need to add more exciting to it. And there are people doing it, and good for them. And I guess our job is to shepherd people through, around, and alongside all of that excitement.
So cool. And so you're not technical, like you're not a developer.
I'm not technical.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. So you basically just figured it all out. Lots of Googling, lots of YouTube along.
At the time. And then it just became a matter of hiring and bringing on board the best people. I'm really fortunate with Caleb and Brown. There's something about that industry as well, that you've got a large section of people who just live and breathe that. Mm-hmm. My team, at 3 a.m. or 2 a.m. at our office Christmas party, there'll be a bunch of laptops out. And there have been multiple instances of me walking over and trying to get the guys to go, come on, guys, it's 2 a.m. It's the Christmas party. And then looking at me sort of like, well, what do you want us to do? Who's going to do the trades? Who's going to, okay, all right. I should not be complaining. And in that way, I'm incredibly fortunate. You guys live and breathe the industry. And that has been it's why we existed. It continues to be why we are able to provide the service that we can. And it is a phenomenal environment to be part of.
So good. Final question on this. What are the 2 or 3 key things you look for when you're hiring someone? Because I feel like, me personally, that hiring is a very difficult thing. I think a lot of people
find it
difficult.
Yeah. I think in both of my industries, which is this crypto and then the psychedelics, in both of my industries, I guess I am fortunate where it is the kind of industry where people are really passionate about this and happy to make this like the biggest part of their life and their identity. And so I can say that is something I look for. I have the luxury of being able to look for people who truly want to devote their life to that of their own accord. And that comes out in their work ethic and their aptitude. So that's 1. 2, this is a vague one, but I try to look for good, conscientious people. There have certainly been people that I have not hired, even though they were probably slicker operators, but were just too slick in a way. Mm-hmm. And I've always just wanted to surround myself with good people. Again, it's about longevity. Maybe it's more boring, but good people you can build with for a long time. And just like investing, it's time in the market rather than timing the market. And I think the longer you have with people who you can build up into a family, the greater chance of success. And if I don't want to spend time with this person outside of work, I probably don't want to spend time with them inside of work. And that's not going to lead to the best possible outcome. So that would be the second. And curiosity. Yeah. I need curious people around me. Mainly because everything I do has been building things up from ground zero and sort of forging and creating new parts that didn't exist. Like nothing has ever been replicating something that has existed before. And so if I don't have curious people alongside me, then I don't have people who are also pushing in similar directions. So there we go.
Love that. Those are 3 really good tips. It's a perfect segue, curiosity, to your current business and where you're currently focused. Can you tell us a little bit about that and
sure.
Why is it so important?
Yeah. So Inursys traverses, I guess, broadly 2 industries and 2 innovative paths. We sit at the intersection of psychedelic therapy and spatial computing, to use a more commonly used but perhaps outdated terminology, virtual reality. And where we started from, understanding that psychedelic therapy had a lot of limitations in terms of resources. It was resource intensive, it was expensive. Psychedelic therapy is based on the principle that the psychedelic experience can produce these phenomenal insights, and then you're dependent on the psychotherapy after to take those insights and put them into practice, to integrate them into your day-to-day life. But the insights that emerge from the psychedelic experience disappear very quickly, they wither away. And it is very hard to try and retain that throughout the next few weeks in which you go through the psychotherapy process. And so we set about thinking about how can we utilize technology? How can we leverage tech to try and solve that problem? How can we leverage tech to, one, try and reduce the human resource burden? How can we leverage tech to try and create a medium or modality in which we can try and preserve those insights? And we settled on using immersive reality for a number of reasons. One, because the immersiveness lends itself so well to creating a transition zone between an altered state of consciousness and your regular state of consciousness, in which it becomes this sort of sandbox and playground for your insights to live and breathe. But also because we saw this as the technology of tomorrow. And I stand by that now, that I see immersive reality in the form of spatial computing as the computing technology of tomorrow. And so that's what I wanted to build in. And my co-founder, Agnieszka, who is genius from another time, has an immense amount of experience working with immersive reality. And she's the one who brought it to me. I was a noob in that area. So that's what Inursys is, or rather started from. We have since grown to a point where psychedelic therapy is just one vertical. We started off building a psychotherapy tool in immersive reality for psychedelic therapy. We since discovered in that process that we'd built a psychotherapy tool in immersive reality, regardless of whether it's for psychedelic therapy or not. And I've been now exploring utilizing that in other verticals, including more conventional psychotherapy for CBT, in chronic pain, in adolescent mental health. And so those are the verticals that we're exploring and starting to build in.
It's awesome. I was lucky enough to experience.
That's right.
It's incredible. It's it's hard to explain, but
it's hard to explain.
It allows you to stop. I think the mind is always racing, especially if you've got a busy job or a family, and that space allows you to completely stop and focus. And it's incredible. I wanted to ask a bit more because I think people who are listening to this might not be too familiar with. Well, I think a lot of people are probably familiar post-COVID about the rate of mental health issues out there. Can you give us some stats around rates of depression in Australia? Sorry to put you on the spot, but
the short answer is no. I can't. I don't have the stats. Sorry, I don't have the stats at the tips of my fingertips. But I can tell you that by 2030 is expected to be the leading cause of the second leading cause of disability affected life years worldwide, which I think is a metric that is often ignored. So it's called DALYs, D-A-L-Y, disability affected life years. We often think of mortality rates, how many people are going to die from this disease, which is obviously going to be higher with heart disease or with cancer. But DALYs is really the impact of a condition on human suffering. And the rates of people dying from depression is low, but the prevalence is so high, and the fact that it's something that people live with for a very, very long time. And it's like that snail that just scratches and scratches and scratches. And that impact is something that can't be ignored. And that the quantum of its impact on human suffering makes it a very, very worthwhile condition to be exploring in terms of therapeutic options.
100%. And there's probably, obviously, the human suffering side of things, but there's probably a massive cost as well to the healthcare system.
To the healthcare system, also to productivity, and then how do you quantify happiness? Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
We put a value on happiness and contentment.
Totally.
Yeah.
And so the normal way or the traditional route has always been, I think, pharmaceutical companies, antidepressants, and specific drugs.
Hmm.
Can you tell us about what's happened in the last maybe like there's probably always been research out there, but it feels like there's been a huge wave, especially in California. Um, Michael Pollan, Tim Ferriss, like there's a lot of research and a lot of influential people coming out now. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Because I think a
About
lot of
psychedelics.
about what's
Yeah.
what's happened in the last 6 years and
Yeah,
what's
sure.
moving. Yeah.
I mean, if you can let me just track back one step and consider that, I mean, yes, you brought up antidepressants, but the origins of mental health treatment was psychotherapy. It always has been psychotherapy, right? Which is an exploration of your psyche, of your mental state to try and correct, examine, reevaluate, and optimize your psychological functioning all the way. And names like Freud, Klein, the origin story of psychotherapy is where it all began. But psychotherapy is hard and it takes time and it takes work, and humans have gotten really lazy and enter pharmaceutical companies and antidepressants. And that has become the principal means of treating depression and anxiety, certainly, but most of mental distress. The thing is, antidepressants can never cure anything. They've never cured anything ever. The idea that if you can sit with the proposition that your psychological state is a result of 30, 35, however old you are, years of molding and gradual evolution and development, both the positives and the negatives, both your strengths as well as your insecurities and anxieties are something that slowly evolved over time to make up what it is now. It's a garden that has developed. The idea that taking a pill is going to somehow magically reverse and change that the way you think, your personality, is an infantile superstition of the human mind. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. So we first need to consider that none of those pills were ever going to cure anything. I think of antidepressants as a bit like training wheels on a bike.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They'll keep you stable for a while you learn to ride the bike. But you've got to learn to ride the bike. Those wheels on their own aren't teaching you to ride the bike, because if you don't learn to ride the bike, when you take the wheels off, you're going to fall. Or if the road gets too bumpy, you're going to fall. And so that's where psychotherapy comes in. And then if we consider psychedelic therapy in that same frame, the effect of psychedelics in treating mental health is not the direct pharmacological effect of the psychedelic on the brain, right? It's not just taking the mushroom and then it creates some chemical change and then it makes you feel better. If that was the case, I've said this a few times before, then Burning Man would be the greatest group therapy experiment known to man.
Totally.
And it is not. Scarcely that.
That's so good.
So then what is it, right? It's evidently, it is the capacity of these substances to create insights from within us, allow us to see the world in a different way, create perspective change and paradigm shift within us, right? And in that way, that garden that we've evolved over 30 years, it allows us to push through, discover new plants within, discover new routes in and out of that jungle. But then it's what we do with that information, because that information doesn't immediately translate to behavior change or personality change. Right? That then takes work, which is why it's called psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. The psychedelic creates a change, it's the psychotherapy that makes it sustainable. That's the paradigm that has seen increasing amounts of research. I mean, this was research that was already started to be done in the 60s and 70s. But obviously, the 50s and the 60s, and then in 1970, Richard Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act, relegated psychedelics to a controlled substance in the same class as heroin, not cocaine, interestingly, not even cocaine, because cocaine was used in cocaine eye drops and therefore was still considered to have a medical use. And so it was actually one schedule above psychedelics. Fascinating. Not to mention that heroin is essentially the same as fentanyl and morphine. In fact, it's metabolized to morphine, and that too is seen to a medicinal purpose. But we won't get all political about it here. So that halted research for a good 50 years. 14, 50 years. And in the last 10 years, I would say, realistically, we've seen a resurgence of that research. And it started very small, but there has been a groundswell. And certainly since, the modern awakening, or the mainstream awakening of modern psychedelic awareness, I guess, has started really, I think, was catalyzed by Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. And bear in mind, Michael Pollan is not a researcher. He's not a scientist. Michael Pollan is an investigative journalist, but an excellent one, and one who writes with an alarming amount of eloquence. And it was that book that really brought modern day psychedelic research to the common man, I suppose. And there are trials happening all around the world. Even in Australia, we can talk about Australia a bit later. And the results have been, started off mixed because we struggle to get enough sample sizes, but there's almost overwhelming evidence now pushing the industry forward. And we really see psychedelics and psychedelic therapy sort of graduating into a realm where it can start to be considered a more mainstream part of the medical framework.
Incredible. How far away are we, or is that impossible to say? When I could go to a local GP, or anyone could, if they've got a mental health condition, or go to a psychiatrist and then eventually get this type of treatment?
Well, the interesting thing is you already can in Australia. Australia, from the 1st of July 2023, became the first country in the world to legalize psychedelic therapy, particularly psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression and MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder. Which set off a huge buzz of excitement. Everyone got really pumped up, and I think there probably were individuals who thought that from the 1st of July they could walk into their GP and get a script for psilocybin and walk out of there. It couldn't be further from the truth. And to give you context, it's been over a year now, and a total of 12 people have been treated in the entire country under the scheme. It's because there have been very stringent safeguards around exactly how this gets rolled out. It is not for prescription to be delivered at home. It is to be part of a regimented process involving the dosing sessions, the psychotherapy sessions, and every application needs to be made to the TGA for a permit. And an application also needs to be made to an ethics committee, a human research ethics committee, to approve this doctor, this psychiatrist. It has to be an authorized psychiatrist. So firstly, it's an authorized psychiatrist, and that psychiatrist needs to have had the adequate amount of training and work in clinical trial settings first. And that authorized psychiatrist prescribing this drug for this patient with this condition, being treated in this way by this team in this location with these safeguards. I'm running out of space to go in a circle, but you get the stringentness of the measures. And I think it's necessary. This is not a runaway train that you want to let loose. You want to have very strong controls on the populace. But the short answer to your question is that it is here already.
And how much does it cost, roughly?
For a course of treatment that involves, and for a properly rigorous course of treatment that involves preparation sessions, usually about 3 preparation sessions, 2 dosing sessions, and approximately anywhere from 3 to 6 integration sessions, which is one-on-one psychotherapy sessions after each dosing session. And consider that all of this is delivered with 2 therapists. So it's always a therapist dyad, gender matched. And you're looking at costs of between $25,000 to $30,000
over
a 6 to 9 month time frame. Which sounds really expensive, but it actually isn't. I consider that sort of price point the discount for early adopters at the moment, because that should increase, because there's no fat in the system, even at that price point.
And then when they layer in VR, that you can do it at home and in the comfort of, or with a clinician, will the price come down, or will it go up?
Yeah.
Or will it get better? or
The
both?
purpose of how we are utilizing VR in the clinical trials that we're about to run is very much to investigate or to demonstrate how utilizing the VR as a psychotherapy tool can reduce the reliance on the therapist somewhat. It'll never replace the therapist, but its capacity to take some of that load off the therapist to act as an ongoing continuation tool, in which all your insights are stored, to be able to extend the effect of treatment. And so in summary, it is to, yes, distinctly reduce the cost, which is what our protocol looks like it will do, to hopefully increase, and this is the bit that needs to be explored in our clinical trial, hopefully extend the effect and the impact of the treatment.
Love it. So cool. Such an exciting future.
It is.
I feel like with this topic, there's like Burning Man, for example. If anyone doesn't know what Burning Man is, it's a huge festival in the desert in the US, in California. But I feel like with psychedelics, there's like so much recreational conversation. That's the first thing people think about.
Mm.
But there's so much amazing stuff and evidence coming out now. So it's really exciting. Prash, I've got now a very selfish question.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to ask you about when people start startups, and I'm using myself as a sample size of one, but we've got 5 founders in our accelerator program at the moment. When you're going through your first startup and you're trying to build something, it kind of feels like building it's like it makes you feel really good. And then a lot of the times you kind of lose track of why you're building what you're building. I was wondering if you have any thoughts around the psychology around that, especially for like early stage founders, and yeah, or even just what your thoughts are and what you've done in the past to help you kind of like course correct.
Mm.
Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. Yeah, it is the curse of getting deeper and deeper into what you're doing, right? This idea that when you're inside the jar, you can't read the label, and you then forget what jam you're making. That's essentially what you're speaking of. I'm not sure that necessarily changes the longer you've been doing it. I think we're all constantly guilty of it. I know I'm constantly guilty of it. We've tried things like, forcing ourselves once every 6 months to sort of put down the tools and go off and think. Like enforced time to think is really useful. But often there have been like significant, like seminal events that have happened which have forced me to take a step back, like a distinct something jars, and rather than trying to sort of flow over it, that has often been a point to stop and go, well, what is this? And to stop and take notice, because if something is not in flow, there's a reason it's not in flow. And to actually stop and take notice has been a really important lesson. I think that can be hard sometimes if you're, for example, under capital pressure, and there are external forces that force you to have to put your head down and get into that tunnel vision and keep going. It's the unfortunate reality. I think the external capital pressures can be blamed for that considerably. I've certainly spoken to startup founders who often blame investors for it, or blame the fact that they've taken investment and now feel this external pressure to deliver on apparently something. So that is a reason. But I sadly don't have any particular special tips other than to state that I'm as equally fallible as the rest of us.
I like the analogy with the jam. I think that's a good one.
Hmm.
Having been inside the jam jar myself multiple times.
That's an Agnieszka analogy. She's the one who reminds me of that one.
I also like what you said before around when you were explaining psychotherapy about all of the things that have happened to you in your life. Sorry about that. Created some sort of mold or change you. And I think that is potentially pretty interesting because a lot of people, well, almost everyone, I think, has imposter syndrome. And especially when they're trying to create something and they have to sell the first time to somebody, and you're like, shit, oh God, I don't know whether I'm good enough or whether this thing's good enough. So I think that is really interesting about potentially some people's experiences in the past may have shaped their preconceived notion of what they're capable of potentially.
I have one point there about imposter syndrome. It is something like most of us that I have suffered from, apart from the time where it was just straight out imposter, right? There's also been that. Remember the early days of Caleb and Brown, and not the early days, maybe when we started scaling, we were getting to this point where I had to stop. In fact, at the time where I realized I decided that I had to step down as CEO and hand over the reins is when I started to feel like a straight out imposter. Like, I'm a doctor leading this. You should not be doing this. But my point about imposter syndrome is that as much as a lot of us suffer it, I think as long as you have the kind of mentality and mindset where you are constantly looking to grow, then we have to accept that imposter syndrome goes hand in hand with that. And the day you stop having imposter syndrome is the day you have stopped growing.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And when you consider that, then you stop running or shying away from imposter syndrome, and rather it becomes a metric or a litmus test to keep you to constantly remind you that you are on the sharp end of the knife edge, which is where you want to be.
More bring on the imposter syndrome. Prash, anything you want to share? Any final thoughts, especially for early stage founders who are just beginning their journey when listening? Anything else you want to plug as well?
This is a broad one, so please edit out my long lapse as I try and think. Okay, I got one. I have spent the last 12 years working on tomorrow. Everything I've been working on has not been an industry of today, but rather it has been one of tomorrow, which has been exciting, interesting. It's the kind of thing that that gets me, and is often the kind of thing that is sold as innovation. The flip side of that coin is that working on tomorrow can be a lonely journey and a painful journey, one which you struggle to find believers for, and one which it can be hard to anything from support to funding to backing. All that can be incredibly hard. And as a startup founder, it is easy to be drawn to the allure of I'm going to innovate. I don't mean this to be a discouragement to anyone, because that is everything that I do and everything that I believe in. But I think it's important to understand the seductiveness, but also the challenges that come with that. And that there is also plenty to gain from working on today. We all need people to work on today and to make today better, as much as we need people to be thinking about what tomorrow looks like. And I think it's important when you are starting up to understand which of the two you are doing and exactly what challenges come with what, so you go in with your eyes open.
That's great advice. Prash, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been awesome.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And yeah, really appreciate it.
Cheers, Dave.
Thanks, mate.
Hey there, before you take off, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you're enjoying this podcast, I would love it if you could 1, hit that subscribe button, 2, rate and review the podcast, and 3, share it with someone who you think could get a lot of value from. Thank you so much again for listening, and have a great day.